Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Andrew Kapinski. If you have really spent some time taking a look at kind of anything that Mandiant does, I am on what's called the Mandiant Communications Center. So I work very closely with John Holquist, Shannon Ronis, quite a few other people, really working on how to tell cool stories about cyber. What we're going to start with today is really kind of a high-level look at what kind of threats are facing cyber threat intelligence and cloud specifically, and how this has really kind of evolved over the past year. I want to start by pointing out some of these Chinese Nexus activity that we've tracked for quite some time. So if you look at how the last several months have gone for cyber threat intelligence, what you'll see is this kind of trend of what we call zero-day summer. This has really been kind of a long-term exploitation effort by some of Chinese activities focus that looked very heavily on how to develop these capabilities to target specifically 0 days that go after certain parts of your network. So what we saw over the last several months was really this kind of heavy focus on what we call edge devices and security network devices. So this really looks at parts of your network that touch everything inside your network and the internet, but don't really have a very broken out inclusion effort into most detection capabilities. This really developed when we started looking at kind of this zero-day summer effort to look at a lot of their focus that really specifies exactly where and how to go after their adversaries. What we think is that this is really kind of a long-term investment coming from Chinese Nexus actors in creating this capability to develop and use these 0 days very, very quickly. If you saw the keynote earlier, what you saw on that screen and what some of our guests were talking about was this very heavy focus on specifically this capability of building out these 0 days that can be used very, very rapidly. But the other thing that I want to talk about is this kind of very specific focus that we've seen coming out of Chinese Nexus actors on malicious activity that allows them to evade detection in the wild. What we've seen is this kind of large-scale build-out of botnets that focus on IoT devices, and they use these botnets very specifically to mask a lot of their traffic, both in the wild and how they interact with their infected components on your system. A lot of this really is part of their build out to not just find really creative ways to get on network and stay on network, but really to try and remain very, very hard to see in the wild. All of this obfuscation, all of this effort by Chinese Nexus actors has resulted, like Kevin Mandiant said earlier, in this kind of really fundamental shift in cyber espionage. For many, many years, we thought that Russian Nexus actors really were kind of at the apex of tracking and coordinating their cyber intrusion efforts as an espionage entity. What we're seeing now is this kind of shift, and it really is this kind of long-term evolution now coming to fruition that we saw coming out of China. There are other actors that we have seen that have really caught our eye lately. I think one of the ones that stood out, if you were kind of around earlier and saw their keynote and their breakout session, my good friend Barney and Jenny Town were talking about North Korea and their efforts to kind of conduct their operations in the wild. What's fascinating about North Korea is that if you look at how they've evolved over this past several years, you have this focus and this really kind of dedicated evolution towards becoming this kind of hybrid offensive espionage and cybercrime entity. What we're seeing is this very heavy focus on cryptocurrency, in which these actors are developing this capability to directly target entities that use and maintain cryptocurrency, but also they've gotten very, very clever in ways to target organizations that don't do that. A lot of what we've seen coming out of North Korea has really focused on this ability to build out this kind of long-term cryptocurrency manipulation. One of the ways that's really kind of setting them apart as being this kind of innovative power in cyber espionage is this kind of fascinating look at how they're laundering this cryptocurrency. A lot of what they're doing is stealing crypto, turning around and using that crypto to buy assets to then mine more crypto. This effectively is really kind of a laundering effort. What they've been able to do is build out this kind of rental service, build out the capability, the capacity, some of the actual physical capacity or hiring contractors out, all of which is enabling them to mine their own cryptocurrency, sell that new clean cryptocurrency that is freshly mined and not associated with having been stolen from everyone, and then use that to fund both their ongoing operations and quite a bit of the regime capabilities that we see coming out of North Korea. John Holquist said it best: if you think about North Korea, what we're really seeing is this kind of single operation, kind of mafia-style family operation, where all of these capabilities are being rolled out in order to support the kind of goals of one very top-heavy organization, that being kind of the state of North Korea. What we're also seeing with North Korean actors is a very, very capable use case for conducting what we call supply chain attacks. This is very, very common. This year we saw the first of what we call a cascading supply chain attack. So there was an original supply chain attack that led to another compromise. That compromise then led to another supply chain attack. Very fascinating kind of instance of how sophisticated these actors have become. And if you look at how they've really kind of developed their capability and built out their ability to conduct these supply chain attacks, use a lot of these other social engineering, which they've become very, very good at, North Korean actors really are kind of front and center when we talk about the best and the most innovative teams out there. Really, when we look at North Korean actors for a long time, we didn't think that they were anywhere near as capable as some of the other groups. That definitely has changed. We now see quite a few other actor groups struggling to keep up in areas where North Korea is showing some real impressive innovation. The other group that I've talked about is Russia. This is an interesting kind of factor in which Russia for a long time was very heavily focused kind of across the board. They were definitely one of the most dangerous groups out there. But really, over the past year, we've seen this very heavy focus by Russia that has narrowed significantly, and it all has to do with what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. Many of these organizations that we've tracked in the past, Turla, Sandworm Team, quite a few other organizations coming out of Russia have really, really been focused specifically on exactly where their troops are in Ukraine. The few instances we've seen where these actors have kind of spread out beyond Ukraine is really still centered on Ukraine. They're still looking at, so if they're targeting organizations or victims in Europe or the US, they're still worried about Ukraine. They're just targeting these victims because they're worried about what's happening or what these victims are involved in that affects what's happening in Ukraine. And lastly, from a cyber espionage capability, we have Iran. They have really kind of been an interesting use case when we look at how these particular actors have been conducting intrusions. I think if you look at these particular nexuses over the past several years, this pattern starts to emerge where Iranian actors are very, very heavily focused on specifically this kind of dissident population that is spread kind of very broadly, and they're also very focused regionally on what's happening kind of directly in their immediate vicinity. The other kind of actors that we're very worried about really has to do with cybercrime actors. If you look at specifically some of these compromises that happened over the past week, when we look at some of these UNC 3944 activity that has really been in the news targeting casinos, what we've seen over the past year and a half has really stood out to us, and particularly when we talk about cloud security. There's been a focus on in the underground on specifically using stolen credentials. For those of you who have been around in security for a while, you might think that this is kind of a return to form, and it is. A lot of these actors are going back to this kind of long-term capability, building out these capacity to steal credentials, obtain them, and then use them in intrusions. What's interesting about what's happening right now, though, is that a lot of these actors that we're seeing, especially when associated with cloud compromises, are using credential theft and stolen credentials in concert with a couple of other techniques like bypassing MFA or simply just being very, very good at social engineering. Depending on how you break this kind of visibility down and how you measure what you're actually trying to, or what questions you're trying to answer, between 60 and 70% of the compromises that we see inside cloud environments center on stolen credentials and begin with stolen credentials. This is really, really kind of fascinating. When I got that statistic from some of our other analysts, my jaw kind of dropped, especially when you look at how intrusions have been happening over the past several years. This return to form is really kind of startling. A lot of these actors are very, very capable, but are really relying on kind of the most common denominator when it comes to conducting intrusions, which is being able to use stolen credentials to get in, move around, and conduct whatever kind of intrusion they want to conduct. This is a fascinating kind of topic for me, especially because if you talk about stolen credentials and the power that credentials have inside an environment, it starts to make a lot more sense when you look at most of the organizations out there that have cloud compromise or some sort of cloud environment in some capacity. Everybody knows that the idea of picking up your organization, moving it entirely to cloud in a kind of one-to-one movement is not only very, very difficult, but in many cases very expensive. It's very, very time consuming to do. The other thing that we have seen kind of crop up is these kind of hybrid environments. You have some of your stuff on premises, you have some of your stuff in the cloud. The only thing that really makes that headache easier is focusing very, very heavily on who in your organization has access to what. And the way to do that is just using identity. And you manage identity using credentials. Everybody knows that this is a very powerful way to really control and track who has access to what in your environment. But now, what we're seeing, especially in cybercrime, but really even in cyber espionage, is this realization is hitting home for them too. A lot of the focus that we're seeing, even in cases where we have cyber espionage capability from some of the most advanced groups out there, Chinese actors who are dropping 0 days every other week, once they get those 0 days, all they're doing is using those to get initial access, and then sitting on network, stealing credentials and using that to move around in network. So really, even the most sophisticated, most time-consuming techniques and tools out there are being used to enable exactly this kind of intrusion. The other interesting thing I think that's developed over the past couple of years is this kind of shift in the underground economy. John Hoke was said earlier that the underground economy is really this kind of perfect capitalist society, and he's not wrong about that. That's a very accurate description. What you have is this kind of very Darwinian situation in this ecosystem where a lot of these actors will chase what's profitable, they'll chase what's safe, and they'll chase what's least likely to get them caught by law enforcement. This shift has really hit home when we look at how and what these actors are trading in the underground communities. A lot of them are tracking quite a bit of not just stolen credentials or batches of stolen credentials from breaches, but the tools, the techniques, the individual kind of rentals of certain kinds of malware that allow them to go out and conduct their own credential theft. This kind of shift in the underground is really leaning towards this kind of fundamental change in how these organizations are conducting their intrusions. They're looking for all of these different capacities that allow them to conduct their kind of criminal operations. And the tools that they are most heavily focused on right now are those that allow them to buy and sell credentials. When we look forward into kind of the future, especially when we look at cloud environments, Mandiant is very, very worried about a couple of different aspects that are starting to evolve. The idea of CI/CD pipelines, so continuous integration, continuous development, really is kind of central to a lot of cloud environments out there for good reason. That makes it very easy to get new capacities, new tools, roll out new storage capabilities, all this different stuff for cloud environment. The problem, though, is that once again, we've seen malicious actors start to realize how powerful CI/CD pipelines are. So they're starting to target earlier and earlier along the software development pipeline in order to make it easier for them to get really, really fast deployment of their malware out to a lot of different people, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. CI/CD pipelines are developed specifically in order to roll out code very, very quickly. This becomes a very powerful tool for actors who have access to it. The other thing that we're seeing, again, is this very heavy focus on credentials. If we look at how these different threats are going to kind of evolve over the next couple of years, I think really where we're focusing our capacity is how these actors out there are targeting these environments that have cloud integrated in some way. The one thing I want to make sure that we kind of make sure, let you walk away with is this kind of line from Sandra that goes back to the early days of the invasion into Ukraine. The line that she said in this briefing and in this op-ed that she wrote was prepare, don't panic. I think that's really where we need to be, is having these discussions openly, talking about these kinds of threats that we're seeing and pushing them out for everybody to kind of have conversations about, so we can understand from your perspective what's most valuable, what kind of indicators, what kind of discussions, what kind of topics, what kind of threats, and you can understand what we're seeing as kind of this front of the line placed now within this broader environment of Google. And we have really spent the last year being able to widen our lens and understand exactly where we sit and how to translate all of this new visibility into everything that we translate out to you folks. I don't have anything else, so I want to say thank you very much for coming out. If anybody has any questions, feel free to let me know. I'm going to be kind of hanging out for a little bit. But once again, thanks for coming out. We will be back again tomorrow. Thank you.